From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Friends, I think maybe we should start so we don't actually get accused of being an Armenian time much longer. I welcome all of you to the 18th Annual Vartanants Day Armenian Lecture, which is sponsored by the African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. The 18th, which, as I said last year with the 17th, it's very hard to imagine that what we started in 1994 is still going on and still presenting extremely rich and, in some cases, provocative programming. Before I start, I'd like to introduce the chief of the African and Middle Eastern Division, Dr. Mary Jane Deeb, who will say a few words for us.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lee, and welcome all of you to the African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. I'm delighted to see you all, and I also want to recognize Roberta Schaefer, the Associate Librarian of Congress for Library Services, who has taken the time off from her very busy schedule to be with us today, and welcome you to the library. As its name denotes, the African Middle East Division, which is hosting the event today, is made up of three sections: the African, the Near Eastern, and the Hebraic sections. We are responsible for materials from 78 different countries in the Near East, Central Asia, the Caucasus, as well as from the entire continent of Africa. Armenia is part of the Near East section, whose head is Christopher Murphy, Dr. Christopher Murphy, who's here at the back. It's a very active division. It's active in acquiring, developing collections, briefing visitors who come from all over the world, and organizing programs, symposia, and workshops. We also organize exhibits, and in 2012, for example, we held a wonderful exhibit, which I know many of you have seen, organized by Levon Avdoyan, and entitled To Know Wisdom and Instruction. It focused on the Armenian book. The exhibit was a great success, and more than 250,000 people visited the exhibit. The exhibit was accompanied by a very important catalog of the library's Armenian collections, really a book, I should say, that was researched and written entirely by Levon and is available for sale in the library's bookstore. This year, it was translated to Armenian. And since I'm doing some division self-promotion here, I would like to point out that we've just opened a new exhibit on the Persian book, 1,000 Years of the Persian Book, and that was organized by the gentleman who's been taking pictures here, the Persian specialist, Hirad Dinavari. And I would invite you all after this event to drop by the Persian book exhibit and see it as well. The African Middle East Division also invites scholars and experts from outside the library who have researched and done work on our region of responsibility to share with us their insights and their findings, so that all of us attending and participating in the programs leave enriched with new information and a better understanding of the culture and societies whose publications we collect. Today's program is a case in point. We are holding the 18th Annual Vartanant Day program. The annual lecture series has become one of the most highly anticipated scholarly and library events dedicated to Armenian studies, not only in the DC area, but throughout the American Armenian communities. The series combines state-of-the-art scholarship with discussions about the library's growing Armenian collections. Our guest lecturers today, about whom you will hear more in a moment, are Peter Hreshtakian from Brussels in Belgium, and Hovan Simonian from Geneva, Switzerland. They are the co-directors of the Armenian DNA Project and will speak on the latest results of the Genome Project, tracing the origins of the Armenian people. And now, Dr. Levon Avdoyan will take over and continue the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jane. I have got to add that this would not be, such programs would not be possible without the active support of people such as Mary Jane Deeb, and I want to point out a few people before I continue. Dr. Deeb, Mary Jane, Chris Murphy, who is the section head of the Near East Study section, who is always ready to support any of our programs. I think I saw Paul Krigo, Dr. Paul Krigo, who is our, did I see Paul? Who is our Armenian language cataloger and acquisition specialist with whom I work to really grow the collection. And I would also, in the audience, like to point out one of our constant supporters, the fifth ambassador to Armenia from the United States, Ambassador John Evans, in the audience. And Father Hovsep Karapetyan, who's joining us, I think, for the first time in the Vartanants lecture from St. Mary's Church. I thank you all for taking your time, every one of you. And I want to talk a little, just a little, about the fact that we have been very fortunate to enjoy the active support of the administration on the highest levels. An exhibit such as To Know Wisdom and Instruction could not have happened without the full support of the administration of the Library of Congress. I would like to now, however, introduce to you a very special person who has been, I think she's become an adopted Armenian because she takes an active part in all the Vartanants lectures, and that's Roberta Schaefer, the Associate Librarian of Congress for Library Services. Roberta.
Well, it's absolutely a pleasure to be here and to add my thank you to all the people that Dr. Deeb and Lee have just thanked. But I think that it's my role to point out another group or another entity that also make things happen at the Library of Congress, and that is private funders who look for a way to assist us to acquire phenomenal collections and add to the incredible coral reef of this institution by giving us their support, financial support, as well as collections. And so actually the beginning, the genesis of the truly spectacular Armenian collection at the Library of Congress started in 1948 as the dream and then the making the reality of that dream by Arthur Dadian, whose purpose was to gather and contribute Armenian language research materials to the Library of Congress. And he passed away, of course, since that time, but I think he's looking down on us today, and he is extraordinarily proud of everything that has happened, and he would be, and he's listening right now, and he's looking forward to this lecture, and who knows, he might even watch the videotape to hear it again after the fact, because after a very long and active life, he's probably got a lot of time to do fun things in heaven that he didn't have a chance to do on earth. But we're also very grateful to his widow, Marjorie, who in 1992 continued his generosity by giving us a wonderful monetary donation. And this was for the health, maintenance, and continued growth of the collection. And so as a result of this, we were also then able to hire Lee to have a specialist for the collection, Armenian and Georgian materials. And at that time, they numbered only about 7,000. Well, you can imagine, after hearing about the exhibition that we had 2 years ago and all, that the collection is now many, many-fold larger. and also that it is used by scholars across the library, not only scholars who are interested in Armenian culture and language and history, but also to compare Armenian culture and language and history to the myriad other cultures and languages that are here in the Library of Congress. Depending on who you ask, the minimum number of other languages would be 430, but then the top number that I hear bandied around is 457. And I understand that the distinction is between some people viewing some languages as dialects and others as freestanding languages. So we'll let the linguists duke that out, and we may even hear a little about that today from our expert. But in any event, we have an enormous collection, and we are happy that it can be used by the public, by scholars, and accessed not only by those who come to the library, but from around the world. Just to show you that Mary Jane was not bragging unnecessarily about how proud we are of the exhibition, I happened to pull off my shelf my own personal inscribed copy in Armenian. And I think when Lee gave me this copy, which came out this year in Armenian, I think he realized that I would only be able to look at the pictures. But I still love it and love seeing that the Library of Congress has produced a phenomenal catalog in both English and in Armenian for all that that means for keeping a language alive and well. So thank you so much for letting me address you today, and I'm so looking forward to the lecture. Thank you, Lee.
Now, it's usually my custom at this point to give an extended report on what has happened with the Armenian collection since last we met. But that was really only a few months ago when Professor Charles de Lambertrie of the Sorbonne gave his excellent lecture on the Armenian language and the Indo-European linguistic group. So I shall forego that step. We have a particularly rich program this afternoon, and I assure you it will fill up our time before lunch. Now, people who know me realize that I'm a traditionalist when it comes to historical studies. Academic fads do not intrigue me, nor do newfangled theories. In the past, when I turned my attention to the origins of the Armenian people, I used texts and relied on linguistic, archaeological, epigraphic, and other types of tried and true research methodologies and the publications of their proponents. Since I first heard of the National Geographic's geometric program, I have been intrigued about the use of DNA to trace deep ancestry. And I was consequently particularly delighted to learn a few short years ago that there was an Armenian DNA project, who knew, which I was very eager to join. And yes, I have had both sides tested, but I will not bore you with the results. Frankly, I'm a bit perturbed that I am neither of royal or noble lineage, so far. Now, what delights me about DNA studies is that it takes us back before racial, before ethnic, before linguistic, and before religious differences, and introduces us in reality to that overused phrase, the family of man. That project itself was started as a tool for genealogical research by Mr. Mark Arslan, who is with us today. Mark, would you stand up today, please, because we owe you a debt. And our guest speakers joined the initiative a while later, and the three remain as administrators of the project, which is a web-based initiative housed at the Family Tree DNA, which is the company used to do the testing on which their data is based. And now on to the program. Peter Hreshtakian was born in Aleppo, Syria, to parents from southeastern Turkey. He grew up in Lebanon before emigrating to the US in 1975. He earned a bachelor's degree in economics and philosophy from Cornell University and a master's in business administration from Harvard Business School. He is the chief executive officer of an international trading and distribution company, but his passion clearly lies elsewhere. He has been the co-author of various academic articles on DNA of the Armenians and DNA of Napoleon. And he has lectured widely on the topic of DNA in both specific and general terms. On a personal note, I have admired the way he runs the Facebook page associated with the Armenian DNA Project, strictly and fairly, and it is now, with its over 1,020 members, a repository for reports and reliable data on the subject. I am also in awe of his knowledge of DNA studies in general, and I think you will see that when he addresses DNA and the origin of peoples, the Armenians. Now, born in Beirut to Armenian parents, Simonian is an expert in Armenian history, historical geography, and culture. He holds a master's degree in international relations from the University of Southern California and another master's degree in Central Asian Studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, at the University of London. He is the co-author of Troubled Waters, The Geopolitics of the Caspian Region, and the editor of The Hemshin, History, Society, and Identity in the Highlands of Northeast Turkey. Conversation about Armenian history with Hovan is quite simply a delight. And today he shows us how this new tool can be applied successfully to historical problems. He will speak today on DNA as pebbles on the genealogical path from the House of Khachen to Eastern Europe. I am going to invite Mr. Hreshtakian to come up and start our lectures, and Mr. Simonian will soon follow. So at this point, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you to Mr. Peter Hreshtakian.
Thank you. Thank you. The mic is on? Okay. Thank you very much for this lovely introduction. I'm really honored to be invited here to speak in front of you at the Library of Congress. Thank you very much to Mary Jane and to Roberta and to Levon for having me here. I hope to share with you some of the excitement of being involved in this relatively new field, which opens a different way of looking into the deep history of people in general and of Armenians specific in this case. We'll start by, for those of you who are not familiar with who the Armenians are and where they live, with the history and the geography of Armenians. This map shows you the various areas in which Armenians lived. In yellow is the current Republic of Armenia. In dotted black, you see the region which is considered historical, the area in which historical Armenians lived over the years. You have on the side the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, which existed for about 300 years after the fall of Ani. And in light brown is the farthest reach of an Armenian empire at the time of Tigran the Great, but it didn't last very long. It was in 70 BC. This gives you an idea of the geographical area we're talking about here. Geography is important, but so is topography, because as you'll see, one of the reasons why Armenians are interesting to study is that they didn't really mix too much with other people once they became Armenian. And I think personally that a lot of it has to do with the geography. Most of the Armenians lived in highland regions, the Armenian Plateau, bounded by the Caucasus Mountains to the north, the Pontic Mountains south of the Black Sea, the Taurus Mountains, and the Zagros Mountains. So it's a relatively hostile geography. A lot of people went through it, but few people seem to have stayed there. So I think the geography has an important impact on Armenian DNA. When we talk about the cultures which were present in the broad area, including the Armenian plateau, and some of these cultures reach far to the north, into the steppes of Russia, over the Caucasus Mountains. You have a list here of all the different cultures going back to 6000 BC. And these cultures have been evidenced by the way people live, the pottery that they used, the tools that they used. And before these times, you had a lot of Neolithic sites in Turkey. You can see the names at the bottom, where they're uncovering very interesting early settlements, early human settlements. And we hope one day that we'll be able to tie all of these cultures and Neolithic sites to the people who are currently living. Armenians, before they became Armenians, about 25 or 2600 years ago, so we're talking 500 to 1000 BC approximately was when the Armenians started coming out as a different people, lived in an area which was inhabited by other ancient people, the Hattians, the Hurrians, Luvians, Assyrians, Hittites, Mitanni, Phrygians, Urartians. These are approximate dates. Don't hold me for them. I mean, they might be off by a few hundred years, but these are all the people who left a record in history. Before that, there wasn't enough written texts about who the people who were living there were. Some of them had languages which we were able to decipher. So how do the Armenians tie to some of these people? I'll try to address that question. Armenia has been, the territory in which Armenians have lived has been conquered many, many times by people who went through it, who stayed, who administered the area for a while, the Sumerians, the Scythians, the Persians, the Greeks, Byzantines, Arabs, and later the Turks, Mamluks, Mongols. And one question we can ask ourselves, did any of these people leave a mark on the Armenians, or did they just conquer the area and without really mixing with the local population? And at the bottom you have a list of all the other people who live in and around the area, and here also interesting questions about what was the interaction between Armenians and these people. So moving forward to some of the big questions we try to answer when we're involved in Armenian DNA, in the context of the topic today, which is the origins of people, because there's a genealogical component, which I will address soon, is what's the genetic profile of an Armenian? Can you define an Armenian genetically? Are we locals? Did we live here? Do we have deep roots in the region, or are we a tribe which came from elsewhere and settled in these regions? And if yes, when did that happen? And as mentioned earlier, do we find in the Armenian DNA a trace of all the people who invaded us or went through the region over the years? And getting more to more interesting issues for the people living now, how close are we to our near neighbors? I'll address that question. And finally, there is a key element in DNA studies which has only emerged in the last year or two, is the study of ancient DNA, donc ancient human remains, to be able to see if the ancient skeletons, the DNA of these ancient skeletons ties to people living right now. Because you can come up with all theories that you want about where people came from and how they migrated, but when you're studying living people, you're only extrapolating. When you're able to go back into ancient DNA, here you can really reach deep into the past. And the techniques to do that have really been perfected and are getting perfected. So we're able to extract minute amounts of DNA from very ancient and deeply and badly preserved specimens. And we'll get to that. So the Armenian DNA Project. Levon talked about the genesis of the project, which had been started by Mark Arslan before Hovan and I took over. The field of DNA studies, and particularly Armenian DNA studies, it's population genetics. It's something that started in the late 1990s. And in 2001, the first paper on Armenian DNA came out. And one of the co-authors was Levon Yepiskoposyan. Levon is the head of the Human Genetics Group at the Institute of Molecular Biology at the National Academy of Sciences in Armenia, and he remains to this day the preeminent population geneticist and the expert in the field. He publishes continually on Armenian DNA and collaborates with other people who are in this field. What's the difference between him and the people like Hovan and Mark and I who started the project? He's a scientist who works in a university And his approach to Armenian DNA is that of a population geneticist. So he goes to an area and asks to take the authorization from the local Armenian community to sample the DNA of the local Armenians, and he takes 500 samples. So it's little swabs, then he analyzes them, and he compares Armenian to other populations. Recently, he and all the other scientists like them have gone into the ancient DNA field, as I mentioned, which is relatively new. But before that, they were using living people. So it's really broad studies. If you were one of the people who donated your DNA for one of these studies, you'd never get any feedback because you'd become a number in a study and you don't know exactly which group you belong to. The Armenian DNA project, so it's a top-down approach. Our project is bottom-up, which means every person who wants to be tested orders a kit. It's an extremely simple thing to do. It's two little swabs, you swab your cheeks, and in a minute it's done. And in 1 minute you can unravel an enormous amount of, once the results come out, an enormous amount of information about your past. And that's really exciting. It's like archaeology in the blood. Try to imagine an archaeologist working in the field, in a dusty, hot field, on all fours with his, just painstakingly removing dust from artifacts to try to analyze them. Here it's archaeology in the blood, done very, very quickly and accessible through the internet from the companies from which you order this. So that's really fascinating. Archaeology in the blood, that's really exciting. I wanted to be an archaeologist, but I don't have the time to, and this is my way of doing it. So there's two ways in which we can approach it when we study it like this, on an individual basis. As I mentioned again, it's information you control whenever you get tested. I'm particularly interested in deep ancestry, going back hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years into the past, beyond history, beyond archaeology. We can do that with DNA. It also has an interesting genealogical component. That's how it got started. And for Armenians, it's useful for a variety of reasons, because Armenians, most Armenians who come from Turkey from in the Ottoman times do not have any genealogical records. They cannot go back oral history about their grandparents and great-grandparents. So we cannot go like Europeans or Americans hundreds of years into the past by going to the archives and looking up birth and death records. So this is one way of connecting to relatives. The second thing is that Armenian last names are not fixed. They change regularly from one generation to the next, depending on what the trade of the person was or what city he came from. So you can't say if you're a Rishtakian that you've been a Rishtakian all the time. So, and a lot of the Armenian names were Turkified also. So, and the third thing is for genocide survivors, people who really are descendants of genocide survivors and have no clue as to where they came from. They can find relatives by taking this test. That's the genealogical component, which I will not be talking about. As Levon mentioned, we started the project. Mark started the project in 2005. It was limited to Armenians from the Keri area, and then he broadened it a little bit. Hovan and I got involved in 2007 personally, and in 2009 we decided to go public with the project and try to make it grow as much as possible by talking about it. And now we've reached the 1,000-member level. Now, you might be asking yourself, okay, who are they testing? What kinds of Armenians? We reach out for Armenians from all over the areas in which Armenians lived historically. So we really have a very broad representation. It's not Armenians from Aintab, which is my maternal town, or from Urfa, but it's really Armenians from everywhere. So a lot of these dots are, we're always looking at the place from which the most distant ancestor came from. And a lot of them are from current-day Turkey. Some still live in Istanbul and other places in Dersim, but many of these trace their ancestry to these places. We also have a lot of Armenians from Armenia, from Karabakh, from areas that are now in Azerbaijan, from Georgia, from Eastern Europe, people who know their Armenian ancestry but have lost the knowledge of exactly where they were from. And of course, we have a whole group of Armenians from Iran. And the southernmost place also is Kesab, the only Armenian village which remained of the Ottoman villages in Ottoman times, which was recently in the news when it was attacked and a number of people were killed and churches desecrated. Genetics, we're talking about DNA, so what are we talking about exactly? How do you use the genetic data? All humans have 24 pairs of chromosomes. I'm going to make it very short and simple so you can understand what we're talking about. 22 of them are autosomes. They're chromosomes which mix once you get bits and pieces from both of your parents. And there are 2 chromosomes which are the sex chromosomes, the X and the Y. Men have an X and a Y, women have 2 Ys. And I'll explain later why it's important. When you compare people's DNA, one thing you can look at is autosomal DNA, which is the soup of DNA that you inherit from all of your ancestors. And here's an example where you have the grandparents in different colors. Their children are a mix of the grandparents, and the children are a mix of all of the grandparents. And you can add more layers and you'll have more colors until you have a rainbow of colors. And after about 7 or 8 generations, you can start missing out on bits of DNA from specific great-great-great-great-great-grandparents. But this is interesting to study when you study a full-blooded Armenian to compare him to other populations. But to go back into the deep history, we're interested in markers which don't get mixed from one generation to the next. And one of them is the Y chromosome. Men get it from their fathers, who get it from their father, who get it from their father. There is no input on the mother's side. So this image shows you exactly that when you get tested for your Y DNA, you're testing one little bit of your ancestry, but it's one unbroken bit from father to son, or son to father to grandfather on the paternal side. And it goes back to the dawn of time, really. You can go back a long time. And what's interesting about this also is the results when you get tested are valid for your brothers, for your father, for your paternal uncle, for your cousins, paternal cousins. So one test is good for everybody. On the maternal side, you have in each cell something called the mitochondria, which is an organism that has been living in symbiosis with human cells for a long time. They're used in energy transfers within cells. And mitochondria also have their own DNA and are passed on from the mother to her children, men, boys and girls, and only the daughters pass them on to their children. So you can use that same marker to go and dig deep into the maternal line. And of course, it's just one little thread on each side, but it gives you an idea of where people come from. So just to recap the biology end of it, this shows you a little bit going back 4 generations, how the DNA mixes, save for 2 things. The mitochondrial DNA, which is the maternal one. We won't be talking about it again because I'm limited in time in this presentation. And the paternal DNA, which is here shown in blue. The rest is all a soup of the DNA of all the ancestors. The only mention I'll make of autosomal DNA, because it's one of the questions I asked before. When you take a 100% Armenian and you compare him to a number of different 100% Armenians, and then you compare him to Turks and Azeris and Syrians and Georgians, you can make comparisons. And when you plot this autosomal DNA of living people using something called PCA, principal component analysis here, you can get graphs like this which show who Armenians cluster with. And when you do this, one of the surprising results, of course, is that Armenians cluster very closely with Turks, especially Turks from Eastern Turkey. And that's not really surprising because once you dig a little bit deeper in Turkish DNA, you see that only a small percent of Turkish DNA actually comes from Central Asia. A little bit more of their DNA comes from Eastern Europe, from the Slavic countries. But many Turks, especially in Eastern Turkey, are descendants of autochthonous people, including Armenians at one point in time. So it's not a surprise if we're close to them genetically. Mizrahi Jews, Mizrahim, the Jews who are neither Ashkenazi nor Sephardic, who lived in Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kurdistan, Iran, are also very similar to us genetically. and Assyrians also, who speak a Semitic language while we speak an Indo-European language, but genetically they're quite similar to us. And we know from historical texts that when the Assyrian Empire reached far to the north, they assimilated a lot of Urartians into the Assyrian Empire. And are the Assyrians living now their descendant? Who knows? But they're genetically close to us. Ancient DNA. I mentioned the importance of this field. There's a lot of people working in this area all over the world, including an Armenian called Cleo Der Sarkisian, who works out of a lab in Denmark. It's very useful to study ancient DNA if you can extract it without contamination, because it gives you a real window into the past. Otherwise, all you can do is extrapolate from current results where people live. But you can only verify this if you can dig people from specific sites and analyze their DNA. When they do that for Europe, for example, they find that the Europeans who lived in Germany or in Spain 3,000 or 4,000 years ago don't correspond to the people living now. It means that migrations of people very often just the people who came superseded the people who were there and absorbed them or displaced them. But it's a very technical and very difficult thing to do. But this is where things are happening now, and we're coming up with fascinating results. I could do a whole talk on this subject, but won't discuss it further. But a lot of the things that I'm supposing are true about Armenians will be able to verify in the coming years once we start doing ancient DNA analysis. What happens when you study the Y DNA, the Y chromosome DNA of Armenians? You can basically or of all human beings, you can basically put them in specific groups. And this is a chart which has been recreated, haplogroups. So the haplogroups are people who belong to a specific group based on shared mutations because they have a common ancestor. So in this specific map, you see the different haplogroups in the world. And you can see that there's a starting point, Africa, for all of humanity, and you can see how people spread out from Africa. And you can see also when they spread out, because you can use this not only to determine which group you belong to, but when the group came into existence and when it started moving. And this is, for example, a chart of the haplogroups of non-Africans. It'll be more meaningful afterwards. The branching points are always, can be tied to one specific individual who developed a mutation, who had a lot of sons, and these sons managed to survive and have more sons. And when you take all the people living now and test them, you can create the tree that you see by going backwards. And on the left-hand side, you can see the years. It's at the top, it's 80,000 years, then 70, 60, 50, 40, 30. The dotted line corresponds to 12,000 years ago, which is when you had a mini ice age in the region, which affected populations everywhere. So you can see that a lot of the groups that are in existence now in Western Asia, in the world, came into existence many tens of thousands of years ago. And when you take a test, you can go back that far. I am J1, for example, and J1 goes back 25,000 years. That's when the man who developed the mutations that all of the J1s in the world belong to have, that was 25,000 years ago, and J was 30,000. So this is really deep, deep, deep ancestry. And then the interesting thing, once you take that and you put people in the different groups, then you have a map of the world and you see which groups they belong to. And Africans remain to a large extent part of their own groups. Then you have one wave of migration out of Africa, which went to Southeast Asia and to Australia and New Zealand, and on to Asia and the Americas. And then you had a group of people who went a little bit later, let's say 70, 80,000 years ago, in the Middle East. And they lived there for a while, and from there they spread out. But when they spread out, it was very often one small group of people who spread out. So when you look at this map of the world, the only place in the world where you have a rainbow of colors of different groups is Western Asia and Central Asia. The rest of the world is very mono haplogroup. And I'll show you in the next slide what Europe looks like. And here in Europe, you basically have one group shown in red, which is R1b, very predominant in Western Europe, and people whose ancestors come from there. You have two groups which are typical of Northern Europe and Southern Europe. You have the Russians and the Slavs who have the group in yellow, which is called R1b. It's only when you start getting into the Mediterranean that it mixes a little bit more. And just to illustrate how this works, because every time it's somebody who develops a mutation, he has many sons, the sons pass that to their son, and once they start moving, that haplogroup starts moving. I'm going to talk a little bit about the European R1b haplogroup, which happens to be also the most important haplogroup in Armenians also. When you test Armenian males, 35 to 40% of them belong to this group, which strangely enough is the predominant one by far in Western Europe. So on the face of it, when you look at R1b and you look at the distribution of R1b that they came up with initially, when you see a map like this, you say, it's clear. It's something that started in Western Europe, and then the people migrated towards the east, and you had a small cluster of these European R1bs. Are they the famed Celts that were immortalized in the Dying Gaul sculpture in Greek times? Who knows? But is this the reality or not? You start digging a little bit deeper, and this is R1b worldwide. And here you see something strange. I mean, you see pockets of R1bs in Asia, in Central Asia. You have a very deep pocket in Africa, between Cameroon and Chad. And you start wondering, how could these people have moved around, and when did they move around? And by actually studying the mutations of the people who belong to these groups, you start building a tree of R1b. And when you do that, you can extrapolate and find out when this group came into existence. And it came into existence 24,000 years ago in the Altai region in Russia, because we've been able to extract ancient DNA, which is R1b, from this period. And then it stayed for a long, long time in Central Asia, in and around the Armenian region, to the north, to the east a little bit, the Caspian Sea, between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. And it only started moving, if you can see here, 3,000 years ago, or a little bit more, into Europe. So all of these Europeans, R1bs, are recent arrivals. And now they represent up to 80 to 90% of the Celtic populations, the Irish, the Welsh, the Breton, the Basques. But whenever we do ancient DNA studies in Europe that go beyond 4,000 to 5,000 years, we never find any R1bs. So when you do the tree of R1b, you see here, for example, that the oldest versions in the little map are centered around Iran and the Caspian Sea, south of the Caspian Sea, both sides. All of the Armenians tested so far who are R1b belong to ancient parts of the tree, and all of the Europeans who belong to these two big groups, including Bernard Pouly, who's a very famous Armenian linguist living in Belgium, country where we reside, belong to some of the more younger branches. And this shows you where some of these younger European branches are located. You have a typically Celtic Atlantic group, you have an Italo-Celtic group, you have a Basque group, and then you have a Germanic group also. So all of these, this is just to show you how you can take DNA studies and the haplogroup studies and the mutations, and you tie them to specific people who lived at a specific time, and you can really date exactly when these branches came into existence. And people in Western Europe, for example, can really know now from which Irish or Celtic or Germanic tribe they came from. That's how accurate DNA testing is. So we get back to the Armenians now after this digression. But I wanted to use this to really illustrate. And I should finish that point by saying that there's a major study going on about R1b, which should come out in the next year or so. I'm not involved in it, but it's going to explain exactly where these people came from and what path they used to get into Europe and they'll try to tie it to historical and mythological texts. When you test Armenians, this is one big surprise a little bit. We are told that we're all the descendants of Haik, the mythical founder of the Armenian nation who finished on Mount Ararat, etc., like an Arab tribe where he was the patriarch. But clearly we're not, because when you test Armenians, this is a sample of 550 male Armenians tested. You get a rainbow of different groups. And you remember that most of these groups came into existence 15, 20, 30,000 years ago, long, long before we became Armenians. So it's clear to me that Armenians are a group of people who were of very different origins, who were probably living in the same place and who coalesced to become Armenians and took on the Armenian language at one point in time and have maintained their Armenianness since. Remember the chart I showed you before here with the inverted tree? Here I've put circles around the big Armenian groups. In black is the biggest group for the Armenians, R1b. You have 30% of Armenians who belong to that. In red, it's the next 3 biggest groups. In blue, you have 3, and in green, it's small groups that represent 1 and 4%. You see that most of these came into existence 15, 20, 25, 30,000 years ago. So we're clearly not all the descendants of the same founder of the Armenian nation. And furthermore, I'm going to go through these very quickly. Once you look at, when I say I'm J1, there are many flavors of J1. Levon is R1A, there are many flavors of R1A. And sometimes you find in certain people only one flavor. And in Armenians, you find very often many flavors. Each of these lines here represents a different flavor of a specific group. I'll go through those slides very quickly, just to show you that not only do we belong to ancient groups, but they had already branched out a long time ago, and we belong to many of those branches. When you compare, I'll talk about Armenians and Georgians later. Now, a question you can ask yourself once you know which groups Armenians belong to and when you can date when these groups came into existence, are they autochthonous or not? I can't expect you to read the small print here, but when you dig into this and you separate what is autochthonous and what is not, you realize that 80% to 85% of the branches to which Armenians belong came into existence in the area in which we live. So for me, it's relatively clear evidence that we are mainly an autochthonous population, that few Armenians came from elsewhere, but only ancient DNA will prove that. Here it's just conjecture by comparing to other populations of the world. And because of our location and because of a lot of the European, Central Asian, and let's say Southeast Asian groups radiated from this area, the study of Armenian DNA is very interesting to people who study DNA of other people, because to them we are like an image of what the DNA groups were before they started spreading out. So our project and Armenian DNA in general is very, very interesting to people who study the subject. So here I think I can answer some of the questions I had asked before. As mentioned, can we define an Armenian genetically? Definitely not, because we have very, very varied ancestry. We are clearly people who have had deep, deep, deep roots in the region, which makes the tragedy of our scattering even more tragic, sadly. We'd managed to stay there for a long, long time, and now we've been scattered a little bit all over the world. But strangely enough, despite the fact that we are very varied origins, ever since we became Armenians, linguistically, culturally, religiously, we've managed to remain relatively stable because this proportion of haplogroups hasn't really changed, and we have not mixed with other populations. It's one of the questions I had asked before. When you look at Armenians living now to see if there is evidence of Arab invasions, Turkish invasions, Mongol invasions, you rarely find any trace of this in Armenian DNA, which is not what I was expecting, but it's how it turned out to be. Some maps to show you. I showed you before the distribution of R1b, which is the most important groups for Armenians. This is the second most important group. Armenians belong to it, but so do most of the people in the Middle East and in Southern Europe. in Turkey and Greece, Italy. This is a group which is clearly associated by the people who invented agriculture, who laid out the first cities, who invented the first alphabet, and then spread out with their inventions in Europe. In Europe now they're finding out that the people who invented agriculture and all these things, who came over from the Middle East, basically did not transmit a knowledge which was taken by locals. They came with their knowledge and they replaced the people who were living there. You can really see that when you do ancient DNA. My own group, J1, is more tied to pastoralists and is found in the highest concentrations in the Dagestan regions. Some researchers believe that it came originally from the Armenian highlands. It happens to be one of the most important group in the Arab population, and also in a large chunk of the Jewish population also. But here, as with the other groups, you can see the different branching outs, where it started, how it spread. This is how we use these tools to see how people move over the years. G is the same thing. It's a very, very majority group now in Georgia and in Ossetia. But when you study the origin of G, you see that it started in the Armenian highlands, and the Georgian version of G is a newer one, and it's much more concentrated than what you find in the Armenian population. So here again, it's proof to a certain extent that some of those important European, West Asian groups saw their beginnings in the region in which we come from. The broad region, of course, which includes some areas where Armenians have never lived but are nearby. Now, a lot of you are probably wondering what DNA has to say about linguistics. The answer is nothing, sadly, because you can't deduce from the genes and genetics what somebody spoke, and you know how easily it is for somebody to lose a language and acquire a new one within a span of a very, very few generations. There are many theories as to the origin of Indo-European languages. Armenians speak an Indo-European language. Some people say it started a long, long time ago in the Armenian highlands. Some people claim that it started in the steppes of Russia further to the north, and that it came to Armenia by way of the Balkans. DNA doesn't really help us in all this, but it can help prove or disprove certain theories. I mean, if we're very similar to people who speak different languages, people who live in the Caucasus and speak North Caucasian languages, people who speak Semitic languages, Assyrians, it's probably an indication that the Armenians who belonged to such a rainbow of different haplogroups spoke a myriad of languages. That I can certify, that Armenians spoke many, many, many different languages before they adopted Armenian. How did they come to adopt Armenian? When did it start? When did it become the language rather than the other languages they spoke? Where did it come from? These are questions that linguists will have to answer, and we'll see if DNA can help them a little bit or not. R1A is another interesting group, a minor group in Armenians, which is divided, when you look at it, into Indo-Iranian speakers and Slavic speakers. And initially, I thought that many Armenians would belong to this if it was true that we came from the Balkans initially, but it's a very minor percentage of Armenians who belong to this group. And we initially didn't know which, the few Armenians are on R1A, which part they belong to. But thanks to genetic studies and mutations, we were able to divide the Armenians. 2/3 of the Armenian R1As are clearly of Indo-Iranian background. They were perhaps descendants of Iranians who lived in our region for a while, or it was older than that. And 1/3 of them come from a pre-Slavic branch, including Levon, whom you can see here. And you can see that this shows you how, when you study mutations, you can really narrow it down to specific people in a specific place, and you can really date all of these things. So Levon's branch came into existence 3,500 years ago. You have a lot of Slavs and Balts who belong to that, but he belongs to one of the branches, the older branches. Same thing for this group. I will pass very quickly. I'll mention very quickly these two groups which are found in the I1 flavor in the Nordic countries and in the I2 flavor in the Slavic countries. There's a small group of Armenians who belong to this, and Hovan has researched them for the purpose of his talk, because there's a specific group of Armenians who belong to this interesting group, and you can see them in red and they have a very strange distribution, and we need to determine where these people came from. I mentioned earlier that we were very close to the neighboring populations when you look at our overall DNA, but when you plot the Y-DNA of men, for example, this shows you Armenians in red and Assyrians in blue. And when you plot who is A, who is J, who is J2, R1b, you get almost the same distribution, which is mind-blowing and shows you that initially we were the same people who ended up belonging to different religious groups and speaking different languages. You can do that with Armenians and Kurdish Jews. These are Jews who never lived in the Near East, who always stayed in northern Iraq, in these areas. And here, again, it's the same colors for both. It's not exactly the same, but you see that Kurdish Jews and Armenians also have the same deep roots. So before Armenians became Armenian and before Jews were Jews, they clearly came from the same part of the world. That's why it's not a surprise that they belong to the same groups. Two more slides to talk about what's the next focus of our research. First, now we're able, through very detailed autosomal analysis, to really break down exactly, to go into fine scale analysis. So we can really break down Armenian populations into subpopulations, and we're studying Armenians who come from specific areas of Armenia to be able to deduce some inferences about migrations and population movements. Here's an example, and you can see sometimes in groups that are Armenians, Turks, Georgians, Kurds, who belong to this. So you can use this to really fine-tune and find out where people came from. This is the focus of the research that's going on right now in Armenia, testing Armenians from very specific countries, and ancient DNA, of course, very important tool. You'll hear more about it. My next lecture in 2 or 3 years will be about what paleogenetics and ancient DNA revealed. And I will now let Hovan speak about his subject, about how we used all of these tools to solve a historical riddle. Here you go.
C'est toi. It is a pleasure to be here today and to meet friends I hadn't seen in years. So, in this impressive surroundings. But I have a problem with books, and some of you might have the same, that the text becomes smaller and smaller with time. There is some sabotage, and I cannot read it anymore until I realized I needed new glasses for reading. 40 years old once you pass that. So Peter has mentioned to you the use of the use of DNA for historical genealogical purposes. And indeed, the development of DNA testing ever since it has been available ever since Genentech decoded the human genome, it has been a formidable tool for historians to resolve historical genealogical mysteries, which until now were shrouded in darkness. You have heard some cases such as when DNA was used to discover whether Anastasia, one of the daughters of the Tsar of Russia, had escaped assassination of her family at the hand of the Bolsheviks, because there was a woman claiming to be Anastasia. And that woman was a fraud because after DNA testing, they realized that all 4 daughters were buried together. Whether the Dauphin, the son of Louis XVI, had died in prison in 1795 or had managed to survive. There were 40 people claiming to be the Dauphin in the 19th century, saying that they were him and they had escaped the jail. And obviously, if all 40 could not be the son of Louis XVI, it means at least 39 were frauds or mentally disturbed people. Peter has been helping French geneticist Lucien Lecoq to test descendants of Napoleon's family. And some of the results have made it into the French media, in the headlines of French media, TV, etc. But the use of DNA by historians it extends beyond these popular cases. It is necessary, all the more necessary in the case of Armenians, because the vicissitudes of our history have resulted in a dearth of archival material and other historical sources. DNA testing can be used to advance the study of Armenia's princely family that have played such a fundamental, primordial role in the history of the Armenian people in ancient and medieval times, and in some regions, such as Karabakh or Syunik or Lori, even into the modern era. I'm going to speak a little bit to give you a summary of Armenia's nobility, so that to help you. We become familiar with them after the birth, with the names of the princely families, after the invention of the Armenian alphabet in the 5th century and the ensuing historical literature which develops. The princely elite under the Arsacid dynasty counted some 50 names with, 50 names and even 70 names according to the Kahnamak, the throne list, a document listing the order of precedence at the royal court of princely families. And that number went down in subsequent centuries, mostly in the Arab period, in the period of Arab domination. Cyril Tumanov, historian Cyril Tumanov, estimates the number of princely family dynasties to 42 in the immediate post-Ardacid period, 35 in around 500 AD, and only 20 by 800 AD. Of these 20, only 3 families, the Patradid, the Ardzruni, and the Sunni, played a prominent role during the 9th to 11th century as they rose to kingship, while the others played at best secondary role if they did not sink into utter insignificance. The number of princely families plummeted further in the mid-11th century in the wake of the disappearance of the main Armenian kingdoms of Ani, Kars, and Vaspurakan, and the Seljuk invasion. The downfall of the kingdoms of Greater Armenia, along with the Seljuk invasion, led not only to the disappearance of most remaining princely family, but also led to the collapse of the social structure around which their existence had been organized. There would be Armenian princely dynasties in subsequent periods, both in Greater Armenia and Cilicia. Yet they operated within a different social structure, particularly in Cilicia, where a feudal system influenced by Western Europe came to replace the traditional dynastic-based structure of the Armenian elite. Armenian lords in Cilicia did not descend from the age-old princely families of Greater Armenia. In contrast to the latter, they did not consider the king as simply a primus inter pares, but rather owed their position to the office granted them by the king. In fact, a list of Cilician lords attributed to Constable Sumbat at the end of the 12th century does not provide the family names of this lord, but gives only their first names and the fortresses with which they were enfeoffed. And in fact, we do not have any names of noble families in Cilicia, aside from that of the ruling families, the Rupenids, then the Hetumids, and then the Lusignan. The elite social structure in the few parts of Greater Armenia that had not succumbed to Seljuk invaders retained more of the features of the old order. Moreover, the brothers Zakaria and Ivane Mekhargerzeli, who were placed in charge of northeastern Armenia after it had been liberated by Georgian armies with the help of Armenian contingents, attempt to recreate the former social structure. Zachary took the title of Shahenshah, as the Bagradids of Ani had done. Yet, most of the princely families of northern Armenia, whether the Orbelian, Khakhbarian, Broshian, or Vachudian, including the Mekhargerzeli Zachary themselves, carried names unknown in the previous era, an indication of a new world. The only surviving dynasties of old were the last scions of the Lore branch of the Patraduni, known as Duridians, a branch of the Mamidoni known in the village of the Ser. This is the village where poet Hovhannes Tumanian was born, also in the Lore region, and the Pahlavuni, who held the function of mayors of Ani. Yet, these remnants of old dynasties were only shadows of their former selves in terms of power and land possessions, even if their prestige remained unaltered, as shown by how the new, more powerful families sought matrimonial alliances with them. The last Armenian kingdom, that of Cilicia, came to an end in 1375, leaving as remnants a few towns such as Zeytun, Hajan, or Tomarza, led by Armenian princes. Princes here must be taken with some because they were just more village leaders, etc. Usually 4 families per town, and that follows the pattern of the Cilician kingdom where there were 4 ministers around the king. So probably it's an imitation of that system. In Greater Armenia, Mongol invasions, particularly the one of Timur-Land, proved particularly destructive to the princely families of the Zakarid period, most of whom disappear at that time from history or become insignificant. The last phase of Armenian nobility opens then, that of the Meliks. The title of Melik was first given in the 15th century by Jahan Shah of the Karan Koyunlu. See, this is one of the 2 Turkmen confederations, a tribal confederation ruling over Armenia, to the Armenian lords of Syunik and Artsakh who were under his suzerainty. Melik came to replace former Armenian titles such as Ishkhan, Nakharar, or Danuder. The institution of Melikdoms increased in scope under Shah Abbas in the early 17th century. Armenian nobility survived also in the neighboring kingdom of Georgia, where many Armenians took refuge. Up to 1/3 of our Georgian princely families were of Armenian extraction. And here, among the ones I counted, I only put the ones who had remained Armenian as being member of the Armenian Church. I didn't include the Georgianized families, which you could add as many, if not more. Both Meliks and Armenian nobles from Georgia were integrated into Russian nobility after Georgia and Eastern Armenia were annexed to the Russian Empire. The Meliks took great pride in their pedigrees. In letters or petitions to the Russian Tsars, they introduced themselves as descendants of Armenian or Albanian kings. The Meliks of Barsum in Gartmank claimed to be Bagradids. Likewise, Armenian noble families from Georgia lay claim to descend from the medieval dynasties of old. Tumanov princes, the family of historian Cyril Tumanov, claimed to be a branch of the Mamidonian family. The Yenit Kolopov noble family laid the same claim. The Arghutian family from Sanahin claimed to be Mekhargerzeli Zakarid and changed their name accordingly when they received the princely title. They became Argutinsky Dolgorukov. So, Dolgorukov means long arm. It is the same meaning as Mekhargerzeli in Georgian. Such claims were not limited to Armenian families of the Russian Empire. In the Ottoman Empire, the Yeni Dunyan, Norashkharian princes of Zeytun, claimed descent from Kor Vasil, an Armenian leader active in Cilicia and the Euphrates region at the turn of the 12th century. The Dedeyan princes of Tomarza claimed to be Ardzruni. Wealthy families such as the Dadian Amira of Istanbul also claim Ardzruni descent, while the Abroyan claimed Bagratid ancestry. Enhancing one's pedigree was not something new. The Rupenids of Cilicia claimed to be related to the Bagratid. Their Hetumid successors claimed Arzacid ancestry. The Zakarid Mekhargerzeli put forward multiple claims. Ardzruni at one point, Bagratuni at another, even Achaemenid at a third, claiming to be descended from king of Persia Artaxerxes Longimanus. Yergainapazut, Mekharderzeli, Long Arm. Khabatian Prussian claimed to be Mamidonian, while the Vachutian claimed Amatuni ancestry. The Orbelian claimed to have descended from the emperors of China. Their name was Jambakur Orbeliani, meaning son of heaven, like the title of the Chinese emperors. A claim also shared by the Mamidonian, leading historians to deduce from this identical claim that the Orbelian were probably of Mamidonian ancestry. Bagradids were attributed a Jewish origin, as were the Amatuni, when the latter were not said to have descended from Astyages of Media. Ardzruni and Denuni claimed to be descended from the two sons of Sennacherib of Assyria who fled to Armenia after assassinating their father. The episode is in the Bible. It was taken from the Bible. The house of Suni was said to be Haikid, descendant of Haik, the eponymous ancestor of the Armenians. The history of Armenia by Moses Khorenatsi, Moses of Khoren, is full of such genealogy, many probably fanciful, and others perhaps based on some elements of truth. Claims of a prestigious pedigree obviously served to boost the status of a family. They also served to increase its legitimacy in both general and particular contexts. This discussion is not our topic for today. Historians have attempted to decipher ancestry narratives to sort out truth from fiction. In doing so, they have often added new contradictory hypotheses on the origins of almost every princely or noble family. Historians should not be blamed. As noted earlier, a lack of sources in the Armenian context has rendered their task arduous, forcing them to use tools such as onomastics to find out which family an individual belongs or whether one family is a branch of another one. As an example, someone named Sambad will be considered a Bagratid. Musher will be a Mamidonian, Merujan an Ardzruni, Mejej a Denuni, etc. This method obviously has limits. Individuals were often named after their maternal families. Thus, the first name Ashod, used by Bagradids originally, but which entered through marriage into the Ardzruni family. Difficult as it may be, the task of finding out the origins of Armenia's aristocratic families and their link with earlier dynasties is an important one. Beyond the interest in the history of every family, continuity of elite is a theme which has always been of interest to historians. In this context, one can see how the use of DNA testing could be of decisive help in the attempt to elucidate some of the mysteries of Armenian history and genealogy. The case study presented today has been chosen because its findings have consequences extending even beyond Armenia. In 822 AD, the last presiding prince of Albania, this is the Albania of the Caucasus, Arvank in Armenian, Varazdertat from the house of Mihranids. You can see the map here. In the orange, more orange, to the right, northeast Albania. This is the original Albania, to which was annexed parts of Greater Armenia in 387. It is the part that you see east of Lake Sevan. And over that area came to rule in the 6th century the Mihranid house. So the last male representative of the Mihranid house, Varazdertad, and his son were killed by a kinsman, bringing to an end that dynasty. The widow of Varazdertad, taking with her the daughter named Spram, rode all night to the fortress of Khachen, where she gave Spram in marriage to Adernerse of Khachen. From the union of Spram, and this is showing the two Albanias, the original Albania in dark green and in lighter green to the south, the areas taken from Armenia and which constituted a sort of new Albania, including Artsakh and Udik. Were issued the princely and later royal house of Gradman Parissos, and it is the area, the kingdom northeast of Lake Sevan, and it lasted until the 11th century, and the Principality of Khachen, which survived to our day. The princes of Khachen adopted the family name of Hassan Jalalian, or were often referred to as such, after the most illustrious member of the dynasty, Hassan Jalal Dawla, who reigned from 1214 to 1261, and who took the titles of King of Artsakh, Autocrat, etc., and to whom we owed the monastery of Gansasar, the beautiful here. Oh, can you see it now? the beautiful monastery of Transasar. The Hassan Jalal dynasty maintained political power until the second half of the 18th century and monopolized the position of Catholicoi of Albania, so Arvan Kida Toredros, with seat at Transasar, with transmission from uncle to nephew until the Catholicosate of Albania was abolished by Russian authorities in 1815. The last Catholicos, Sarkis Hassan Jalalian, was given the title of Metropolitan, so was his nephew and successor, Bardasar. The House of Khachen thus presents a case of remarkable longevity. From its beginning in the early 9th century, its survival throughout the tormented period of Seljuk invasions, its role as one of the major dynasties of Zakarid Armenia, and then as one of the 5 Melik families of Karabakh, the famous Melikites of Khamsa. Khamsa in Arabic means 5. There is disagreement among historians about the family to which Adornerse, the primogenitor of the House of Khachen, belonged. Onomastics cannot help in this case, as Adornerse was a first name unheard until then. 3 rival hypotheses on the family origins of Adornerse have been offered by historians: Aranshahik, Sunni, and Bakradid. Aranshahik are the kings of Albania. It's the first dynasty ruling over Albania. After then the Arsacids and then the Mihranids. Medieval sources provide us with the name of Adornerse's father. Adornerse is called son of Sahal, who had seized the canton of Tiran by force in the history of Albania by Movses Dashkuransi. While for Arab historian Al-Tabari, he is Adornerse ben Ishaq el-Khashini, meaning Adornerse, son of Isaac of Khachen. So we have 2 hypotheses: either he's the son of Sahal or he's the son of Sahak. But it doesn't stop, the problem do not stop there. To one group of historians, Sahal would be the same as the Sahal ben Sambat. So Armenian princes adopted the Arabic kunya during the period of Arab domination. So Sahal ben Sambat of Arabic sources, or Sahal Sambatian, made famous for his capture of the rebel Babak in 837. Sahal is described as Aran Shahik and of the Zarmiragan family of kings by Dashkuransi again. Yet on the basis of the name of his father Sambad, he is believed to be a Bakratid, descendant from the sons of Sambad, who migrated to Shake. Shake is to the north in that map, to the very north, on the north side of the Kura River. It is still called so. Migrated to Shaki in the 8th century after blinding the eyes of their uncle Adarnaze. Adarnaze is Ashot Bakraduni, prince of Armenia, in the 8th century, while Sambat is his first or second cousin and predecessor in that function. Adons and Tumanov have brilliantly demonstrated how the sons of Sambat, disaffected that the function of prince of Armenia went over their head to their father's cousin, joined with the Mamedonians in attacking Ashot and took part in blinding him. There is also disagreement about the area over which Sal ruled, whether it was north or south of the Kura River. Should the father of Adornerse be Sahar, then the candidate is Sahar Sunni, prince of Kerar-Kunik and Sot. This is the area surrounding Lake Sevan in dark green. There are multiple references on Adornerse and his descendants as Haikid, i.e. descendants of Haik, which could ultimately reinforce this hypothesis. Yet, Haikid epithet could just as easily be used to describe members of the Aran Shahid dynasty, whose legendary founder, Aran, was said to be the son of Sisat, the ancestor of the Sunni dynasty. In summary, the following hypotheses are offered. Adornerse is the son of Sahal Sambatian, and both are Aran Shahid. The supporters of this hypothesis disagree about the area over which Sahal ruled. Should Sahal have ruled only over the south, the Armenian provinces of Artsakh and Udik, while the family ruling over the original Albania north of the Kur was not descended from him, and could have been Aran Shahid or Bakradid. Adornerse is the son of Sahal Sambatian and both, this is second hypothesis. Adornerse is the son of Sahal Sambatian and both are Bakradids. The supporters of this hypothesis tend to believe Sahal ruled over both banks of the Kura River. Adornerse inherited the south bank, while another son, Hovannes Muawiyah, inherited the area on the north bank of the river. Third hypothesis, Adornerse is the son of Sahak, prince of Western Sunnik, and hence is a Sunni. He is not related to Sahal Sambatian, who is Aran Shahid, or Bakratuni perhaps, Tumanov first thought he was Patraduni, and then he said, no, he's Aranshai. Adernese is the son of Sal Sembatian, who is a Sunni. That's Hewson's latest opinion, Robert Hewson's, before he thought that. Anyway. So, to attempt to sort out this quagmire, I tested 4 members of the Hassan Jalalian family. The 4 individuals do not know one another, an indication that they are distant. And they also do not match on the autosomal test. So autosomal test is the test on the 22 chromosomes or 23 chromosomes. So they are at least 5 or 6 generations distant from one another. This is to reduce what is called in DNA jargon the non-paternal event. But the non-paternal event is adoption, is transmission of family name through daughters, or illegitimate birth, a wife cheating on her husband. So you try to, it never happens. You try to take as many people as possible from one family and distant branches to eliminate or reduce as much as possible that risk. So the results found is that member of the Hassan Jalalian family belonged to the I2C, what is now the I2C group. When we started, it was I2. It shows you how dynamic DNA studies are, and with a new branch has been discovered, nomenclature changing. It is certainly not one of the largest group among Armenians. It's 5%, you would say, even less than that. And in Karabakh, it is even less than that, because in Karabakh, the predominant group is R1B1A2. So clearly, the Hassan Jalalian are outsiders they are not natives to Artsakh. And there is nobody among all the Melik families that belongs to the same haplogroup as them. The only other family is that of the Melik Mushtambarian, who are a family from Karadagh. Karadagh is just south of the Arat River, south of the border in northern Iran. So much about, historians since the 19th century, even before, always argued that all the Meliks of Karabakh are descended from one dynasty. They disagreed which dynasty it was, Aran Shahid or Sunni, but they thought all 5 Khamsa Meliks come from the same root, and it's clearly not the case. So who are the people closest to Hassan Jalalian, aside from the Melik Mushtambarian, who are not, this is showing you how they match, all the individuals I tested match one another. We have a few Armenians from Durun in Cappadoce. And all are related with a founder effect, meaning that they have a common ancestor who lived a few hundred years ago. One of these families has preserved in narrative the memory of having migrated to Durun from Ani, the medieval capital of the Bagratid dynasty. We also have one Georgian who belongs to the Tsitsishvili princely family. Where did I? Okay. He is the one marked in Turkey, just if you go straight west from Gyumri, in Turkey, south of Batumi. That's where Panaskert, the historical Panaskert, is. And the original name of the family was Panaskerteli. That's the Armenian-type province, Tao. It was a traditional patrimony of the Bagratid families. And Tumanov believed that Tsitsishvilis to be Bagratids. So the uniqueness of the Hassan Jalalian among all Karabakh Melik families in belonging to I2C, their proximities with Armenian families originating from Ani and with the Tsitsishvili leaves little doubt about their Bagratid ancestry. So ultimately, Adons was right, and Minorsky was right. Vladimir Minorsky were right. Hassan Jalalian and the Melik Mushtambarian are descendants of the sons of Sambat, I had referred to earlier, who fled to Shaki, to Albania, after having blinded their uncle Ashot. Now, the Dargav district of North Ossetia here is the home of the Taga or Tagaur clan. Tagaur aristocracy claims to have descended from an Armenian prince who took refuge in medieval times among the Alans, the ancestors of the Ossetians, after being dispossessed from his inheritance and lordship by his uncle. The story sounds familiar? It should be. Two Ossetians, one of whom is a Taga. Incidentally, the person we tested is the first cousin of the president of North Ossetia, are among the people relatively close to the Hassan Jalalian. So the story of a prince dispossessed by his uncle is very close to that of the sons of Sambad, and too close not to suspect actually we are facing the same story. There is little doubt that the member of the Mamsurov family, who are one of the Taga elite families, are themselves must be descended from the sons of Sambad. One must have crossed from Albania into Ossetia. The area in blue, surrounded in blue, number 4, is where the Taga clans live. And Taga is derived, I'm almost finished. And Taga may be derived from the Armenian Tag, which is the crown, and Tagaur is Tagavor, the king, an allusion to the reference to their royal background. So now, beyond the Ossetians, and that's why I chose these case studies, all of this, the Armenians who are A2, the Georgians, and the Ossetians, the people then closest to them, they are relatively numerous, and they all indicate various countries of Eastern Europe as place of origin. And all of these people are of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. In all likelihood, the connection between them and the I2C from the Caucasus must have taken place through the Khazars. It would be difficult to conceive of another possibilities. The relations between the Khazars and Ossetians in the Middle Ages are well known, not to mention the episodic Khazar invasions of Transcaucasia. So to conclude, thanks to a few people we have tested, a few tests, a little bit of saliva, this is what we have been able to determine. We have been able to find out the YDNA of the original Bagratid dynasty. The Georgians have been working on the Bagratid dynasty, but in the case of the Georgians, it's descent through female line, because Queen Tamar married an Ossetian prince, David Soslan, and from then on it is the line of David Soslan. So they did some DNA testing, and they belong to the line of David Soslan belongs to the Q1 or something like this line. It's something which kills the Georgians, that their royal family is of Armenian origin, the Bagration, and then from an Ossetian, David Soslan. It's really something very difficult for them to swallow. We have been able to find the origins of the house of Khachen, the Hassan Jalalian, so determine that they are in fact Bagratids and not Aranshahid or Sunni. The origins, we have been able to confirm the origins of the Tsitsishvili Panastirteli princes. At some point I thought maybe they may be Mamedonian, because Taik belonged to the Mamedonian before it passed to the Bagratids, but obviously they are Bagratids and not. We confirmed that the tradition of the Tagaur aristocracy was not fiction, but it was they indeed have something Armenian, and Bagratid on top of that. And also the links between Ossetians and Khazars. I mean, Ossetia, Alania was included as part of was vassal of the Khazar kingdom. And we have been able to establish that at least some Ashkenazi Jews are indeed of Khazar origin, because there is this discussion that are Ashkenazi Jews Khazars, or are they from the Jews which came from the Middle East? I cannot answer the question for all of them, but at least here at this micro level, we can see that some of them at least are of Khazar ancestry, because I cannot see how it could have been otherwise. So it's quite ironic findings, because there is this, Movses Khorenatsis says that the Bagratids were of Jewish origin. And it turns out that it is not so, but it's the other way around, that some Jews now are Bagratid origin. And also, it was a Tsitsishvili, Prince Tizianov, prevented the Armenian Melids from receiving the princely title when Eastern Armenia, when Karabakh's unit were integrated in the Russian Empire. He said that Georgian princes would not accept It would be an insult to Georgian princes if the Armenian Melites received the princely title. As a result, the Melites were integrated as hereditary nobility, nobility without title, noblesse héréditaire in the Russian nobility of the Russian Empire. They did not receive the princely title. So Tizianov had no clue that he himself was related to the people he was saying that they were not worthy of becoming princes. He was preventing his own kin of receiving the princely title. So he didn't realize that. And the DNA studies obviously has some limit. For example, I'm not able to determine if indeed there was a link between Adar-Nerse of Khachen and Sahal Sambatian, Sahal ibn Sambat. What I suspect is that they were certainly related. They were from the same family. Whether they were father and son, I doubt very much. But all of them must have been descended from the three brothers, the three sons of Sambat, who in the mid-8th centuries left Armenia, went to Shaki in Albania and settled there. And this family, which it is the branch which survived the most, even though they were dispossessed, they lost Armenia, but somehow this exile were in the end beneficial to them since they have survived to this day. Voilà. Thank you. Sorry for taking so much time. My apologies.
Frankly, I could go on and listen longer, but after a break, I have my regrets. My regret is that I am obviously too old to say that I will see the results of all of this research, but I think you join me in admitting that this is fantastic, that this is cutting edge, and that the Armenian background is serving a very good purpose in the study of DNA and deep ancestry. Now, we are not going to have a Q&A time. We had already determined that because I invite all of you tomorrow from 10 to 11:30 to a workshop that both Peter and Hovan are running in the Madison Building, the West Dining Room of the Madison Building, which will be a conversation between the three of us and the audience. So if this interests you, please do join us. After I say my goodbye to you, please join us for lunch, which is waiting for you. Allow our guest speakers, please, to have a couple of minutes to enjoy a little food and have at them, because we would like these receptions to be a mingling between our guests and you. And I finish off by saying I will see you next April 2015 for the 19th Vartanants Day lecture. Thank you both.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.